In the West, the vampire has effectively been defanged, whereas several centuries ago, families would huddle around the fire, fearfully whispering tales of the strigoi that stalk the nearby forest by night. Nowadays, a vampire is robbed of its ability to scare, not by exposure to the rising sun, but by the blazing glare of a spotlight, dragged screaming into the light of understanding by movies, novels, and television dramas. The creature once feared in the folklore of Europe has become a parody in a pantomime, a costume for youngsters to wear on Halloween, and a character in children's puppet shows. This is understandable. Any psychologist worth their salt will tell you that one of the most basic strategies we as species use to deal with trauma and fear is to attack it with humor. The process is akin to milking the fangs of a snake of its venom, or cutting the stabbing tail from a scorpion. We as a culture take the things we fear and paint them in gaudy colors. By dressing them up in silky costumes, we make them figures of fun or empty caricatures, because by doing so, we can take some of the fear away. This is in the West. In the East, things are different. In the Philippines, where my parents are from, and where I spent the first 25 years of my life, we do not make mock of monsters. It can be difficult for some people to understand, and certainly I have friends who have shaken their heads in disbelief, but I can tell you, without a moment's hesitation, that there are still places on this earth where people live in fear of the Manananggal, the Philippines' own particular species of vampire. Even to this day, both in the rural areas and in the tightly packed streets of a metropolis like Manila, people will lock their doors and bar their windows for fear of the things that wait in the dark. Many Westerners will look upon such fears with a level of condescension, as if harboring such beliefs makes the populations here somehow less developed or enlightened, forgetting in the process that it was only within the last 100 years people in Europe were still being accused of vampirism, and less than that since the last female was charged in Britain with the crime of being a witch. Religious groups across the West believe fully in the literal existence of demons and that they are engaged in spiritual warfare. So why should it be that we are somehow less advanced just because we retain our beliefs? Perhaps in years to come, what are now considered folk beliefs will be proven to be zoology. The creatures we fear, not supernatural, but naturally occurring beasts, yet to be discovered and understood by science. This is not so implausible, especially when you consider that the pongo and camel leopard were considered ridiculous native myths for centuries, right up until they were confirmed to exist and reclassified as gorillas and giraffes. In the meantime, the people of my homeland do not have time to worry about the scientific establishment and the way it sneers down its nose at such beliefs. After all, how can you say you don't believe in a thing when it's tearing at your throat? A perfect example of this can be seen in medical practice of certain provinces of the Philippines, where I began my training as a doctor. In my early career, I worked as a paramedic and would attend accidents and emergencies, giving life-saving treatment on the spot to people who required medical care immediately. In this task, I was joined by a team of other highly qualified medical professionals, people who between them had more degrees than a protractor factory, and who on most occasions would apply what Westerners would recognize as standard modern medical care. These were intelligent, articulate, and well-educated men and women. They were also men and women who firmly believed in Manananggal. The evidence for their belief could be seen in the equipment that they carried, for alongside the usual drugs, syringes, and medical equipment like defibrillators and oxygen apparatus, these doctors also each carried a leather satchel filled with what we might call alternative therapies. In these bags, one might realistically find charms made and blessed by local shaman, tinctures, and concoctions of herbs proven in folk practice to be effective against certain ailments. You would also find certain items not meant for defense against infection, but as protection against things that hunt. A typical bag would contain religious artifacts, such as crucifixes and holy water. They would also contain several bulbs of garlic, which in keeping with the Western tradition, is also thought to ward off vampires in Filipino folklore. Perhaps most spectacular was the inclusion of a tail taken from a large stingray, its flabby end snaking around the other equipment as its long barb pressed against the soft leather of the bag. This instrument in particular was considered to be a valuable weapon for use against the Manananggal. In fact, I once saw one of my colleagues use one. The incident we were called to had always promised to be a bloody one. The report we received was that a local man had been hit by a train, and honestly, on the way there, we were mostly expecting that there would be very little we could do for him. Still, we rushed to the scene, armed both with our modern medical equipment and stuffed under a seat in front of the ambulance the small leather bag filled with magic. Arriving at the scene, I knew immediately that removing the victim, whether alive or dead, was going to be more difficult than we first thought, and that we were almost certainly going to need our head torches. The train, I saw, was protruding out from a large tunnel. The back end of the train, made of a few carriages, was still sticking out of the tunnel and bathed in what little of the dwindling light remained. The 5 or 6 front carriages, however, disappeared into the darkness of the tunnel, as if its entrance were an enormous mouth that had opened up to swallow it. Whoever had been hit by the train, they had been struck somewhere inside the tunnel. As we approached the entrance to the tunnel, a man in uniform emerged from the darkness with a look of utter despair upon his face, gripping my colleague's shoulder to stop himself from falling over. He informed us that the victim had been cut clean in half. Of course, my initial reaction to this news was to assume that we were most likely going onto the tunnel to retrieve a corpse. Yet, from somewhere inside, from beyond the point where the light suddenly ended in a stark, enforced border with the darkness, a low wailing howl of despair and pain echoed from somewhere within. Immediately, I lifted my bag and proceeded toward the entrance of the tunnel, only to be stopped by one of my colleagues who gripped me firmly from behind, pulling me back before crossing himself. "Do not go," he said firmly, turning back toward the ambulance as if preparing to leave. Obviously, I was stunned by this order and just about to refuse when the wail came again, different this time, deeper, lower, and I might have said less human. For a moment, I wondered whether an animal might also have been hit by the train, since the deep, resonant growling sounded more like a dog or some kind of a big cat crying out in pain. As I looked back into the perfect circle of total black, my colleague reappeared by my side. Now thought he was holding in one hand the small additional kit bag and in the other hand the long tail of a stingray. "This is not the first time," he announced firmly. "Many times the trains are stopped for this reason, halfway into the dark, and many times we hear that the victim is supposed to have been cut in half." He paused here and shook his head solemnly. "We have lost many good doctors because of this." He muttered his final thought with a slow shake of the head, a gesture which convinced that this was a man who knew which he spoke. "Manananggal," he said, almost in a whisper, "have this ability. They can separate their lower half from their upper. Doing this, they appear like victims, cut apart by the train. Doing this, they wait for us to come and help. Then, when we approach, they feed." I too heard these tales. In the accounts I'd heard of this creature, this thing that fed on human blood, the upper portion had huge bat-like wings. In some tellings, the Manananggal was almost wolf or dog-like. The structure of its face and head was rigid, protruding and bestial, sloping into more of a snout or maw than a normal human face. In other accounts, the thing took human form, a young girl with lank, dark hair and eyes the color of ebony. She again would hunt with enormous bat-like wings, stalking her prey like some dark angel adorned with talons and teeth. "There may be a patient in there," my colleague said, pointing again to the darkness of the tunnel. "But who would stand in the train tunnel, I ask you? Who would wait there for the train? Even if hit, the chances of being cut perfectly in two are slim. Something about this feels wrong. It feels..." He swallowed hard and held up the limp, leathery-looking tail. "It feels like a trap." No sooner had the words fallen from his lips than the decision was made for us. I cannot ever confirm exactly what it was that burst out from that tunnel. Were I asked to place my hand upon the Bible and swear it was a Manananggal or a vampire, I could not. In truth, I could never swear as to what it was, other than to say that I believe it was nothing human. The shape, a blur of blacks and cold, fish skin gray bolted from the tunnel and out into the night like an enormous bird, larger than any species living in the Philippines, and bigger, I think, than any alive today. The shape, a blur of blacks and cold, fish-skin gray, bolted from the tunnel and out into the night like an enormous bird. Its wings were not feathered, but rather smooth and black, like the stretched leather of bat wings, though many, many times larger. I can also tell you that between those wings was what appeared to be a human torso, arms dangling limply as a face, shone only for a second, screeched past any flash of color. I can also tell you that when we finally did enter the tunnel, we found nobody on the tracks, but two workers who had left the train to investigate and were very badly injured. Accounts in local newspapers spoke of how their injuries were consistent with animal attacks, suggesting that perhaps they were bitten by a bear or even tiger, despite there being no tigers in the Philippines. The official explanation, meanwhile, said that they had fallen into the dark, become confused, and somehow managed to cut and mangle their necks and upper shoulders, tearing the flesh to shreds on the workings of the train's machinery. Of course, my colleagues had a very different explanation, and from then on, I treated any report of a train accident with more than a little suspicion. I also carried the tail of a stingray alongside my usual kit.